Welcome in to the DAV Podcast, episode number 5. I'm Dan Klaskett, along with Ashley Burns, and we're happy to be here, Ashley, back at it with another episode.
Yeah, always excited to be here. It's a good time on the DAV Podcast, that's for sure.
Yes, and lots of good stuff for you today. We are getting into really a very important topic, missing in action prisoners of war. That's what we're talking about here in episode 5. We're going to talk to some folks that have been directly impacted by this and looking at ways others are honoring some of these brave heroes. And Ashley, obviously, this is going to be a great topic today. A lot of good things, good work DAV's doing for folks that are new to DAV and disabled American veterans and never really been involved with us before. Let's talk just at a high level, some of the ways that we help over 1 million veterans a year in life-changing ways.
Yeah, so DAV is an organization that's been around for almost a century. We're very excited about coming up next year is going to be our centennial anniversary. For nearly 100 years now, we've been helping veterans with everything from assisting them with claims for their earned benefits to some of our more recent endeavors, which includes employment services and helping veterans and their spouses and active duty military find really high quality employment opportunities when they're transitioning out of the military. We provide voluntary assistance to veterans, disaster relief to veterans. So there's really it runs the full gamut of services and programs that are available all at no cost to America's injured and ill veterans.
That's the best part of that is it is, as you mentioned, free for these veterans to get that help. We couldn't do that without the generous support of all of our donors and everybody else out there. And if you're a veteran that needs help, want to learn more about our services, or you'd like us to help some veterans, you can do both. Go to DAV.org. And while you're there, you'll find our podcast page, DAV.org/podcast. And you can keep up with all the news here on the podcast. Just subscribe, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher as well. And we're really looking forward to the topic of the day, missing in action and prisoners of war, but a lot of good topics we're going to have for you ahead. And if you've missed out on the previous 4 episodes, we invite you to check them out there as well. Had a good one on the veteran suicide issue that's going on right now. We've talked obviously about our live days and
that's a good one.
Yeah, some great content out there. And of course, you want to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram as well. And actually, let's dive right in because a lot of good stories to tell on this episode. And we'll start up with this first one, the story of Ann Mills Griffiths.
So our first guest on the episode is Ann Mills Griffith, and Ann has a very personal connection to this cause. Ann has led the National League of POW MIA Families since August 1978. And her brother, James B. Mills, who was a radar intercept officer in the Navy, was actually lost on a low-flying night bombing mission. And Ann was at her parents' home when the Navy came knocking with that devastating news. Ann says she recognizes that we live in a country that moves heaven and earth decades later to help identify and bring home the remains of veterans missing in action.
Yeah, it was when he started his second tour, right as he was leaving. We were out in the front yard, and he was throwing my daughter up in the air, who was 4, and she remembers that very well. So it's when he was leaving, and I felt then that I'd probably never see him again because it was his second tour and they were not being allowed to take out targets that they knew were threatening and were shooting down people right and left. So, but that's what I remember. And then the other one that is a clear memory, it's a picture on my wall and it's him going up the steps, the gangplank steps at the ship when my mom and dad were telling him goodbye at Alameda Naval Air Station. The guy who came to notify Mother and Daddy, who were the primary next of kin, and I just happened to be there, was a family friend. And my dad had just told me that Paul, Coach Briggs, he was the football coach for Bakersfield High School. My dad was in education always until he retired. But he said he wanted to come over and see my dad. Well, they dealt together on all sorts of things having to do with school administration and athletic programs and all that. So Daddy said, it wouldn't have bothered me except that he asked if Mother was here. And it occurred to me that, and this is before he got to the door, that he's also a commander in the Navy Reserves. And so he said, I've got an uneasy feeling. And then I'm watching out the window, and sure enough, here he came in a Navy vehicle. Walked in the door and notified my mom and dad and me standing there. And Mother got very upset, of course, and I just looked, and it was sort of like I knew it. As soon as I saw the Navy car, I knew for sure. But they said he's only missing, which is what everybody's told, because they're not killed in action, they're missing in action. And in fact, that is what has motivated my 40 plus years of effort. It was because of the circumstances. Flying off the carrier at the speed they were going, disappearing off radar, no sighting, no anything. My family was pretty realistic about the chances that we would ever get any definitive word. So we were always very realistic about it. But both of us, and certainly me for all these years, continuing, it's because the uncertainty is the motivator to do what you can. But in my case, not so much for my brother, because we really never expected anything. I mean, there's always a remote hope. But actually, in June of 2017, the year before my brother's remains were recovered and then identified, they were able, in fact, in 2011, to locate the site, the underwater site along the continental shelf of Vietnam, so relatively shallow water. But they located the canopy frame, a stainless steel canopy frame that belonged to the aircraft that they were in that night. And so when they did that, I thought, well, they found a site, but after all these years, finding remains, if they went into the water at that location at the high speed, chances are not high. And so then it was 2017 when they did actually recover remains of the pilot, now Captain Jim Bowder. And so I said, okay, one more try, but if you don't get any remains that are identifiable, and this was in 2018, same time of year, it's the kind of site where you can only go there one time period a year because of the underwater currents and the turbulence and the lack of clarity. You can't see underwater, a whole lot of impediments. So when they did, they found a rib bone, which is about biblical, but it was large enough remains. They were able to cut it and match it with my family's DNA. And I said, are you kidding? I'm so happy. I'm so shocked. But it's a happy shock. It was just confirmation of what I knew. When they found the pilot, I knew it was the right place. It happened then, at that time, in that location. 52 years, almost to the day, 1 month different. And I don't use the term closure because it's overused, and it doesn't, you can have a memorial service and someone will ask you, does that bring closure? No, it doesn't. What it did for me was reserve a spot at Arlington National Cemetery if and when, which was highly unlikely, they ever recovered remains, that he could be buried at Arlington. So that's really the main reason I did it, and because I'm the primary next of kin, I wanted to make sure that there was a place for him if he was ever found after I was gone or whenever. More than anything else, my primary role over the last 40 years is to make expectations reasonable, responsible, raise awareness of the fact that we need answers. It is now. There is so much awareness. It's our POWMI flag that it's known around the world. And many other countries are following the U.S. lead in this. It's changed the country. It's left a lasting legacy. And if nothing else, and it gives the families hope, if they can find my brother, which with all my involvement, never thought was possible, miracles happen. They just do. And there's a lot of hardworking people that work very diligently and with great dedication to make that happen. I think it speaks volumes. And it's one of the things that has been so important to me, and that's the lasting legacy of the National League of Families and all that we have sought to achieve and worked to have happen, and the budgets and you name it across the board. If it hadn't been for the National League of Families, it just wouldn't be happening. We would not be going back to recover remains from World War II and the Korean War and identifying them. And of course, there's many other factors like scientific advances in the DNA process. Today's military, they all have DNA samples on file in case anything happened to them. None of that existed.
What a great story that was, and one of many we'll share for you here today on the topic. And 50 years later, 1,589 soldiers that served in the Vietnam War are still missing. The MIA POW Vietnam War bracelet was an idea started by two college students in the 70s. The bracelets became the name of an individual soldier and the date they were listed as missing. Even today, people still wear the bracelet as a silent reminder of a soldier who did not come home. Some filmmakers wanted to know why. Recently, A documentary producer met with a woman whose brother was reported missing in 1966. 44 years later, his remains were found and returned to his family. A family friend wore his bracelet for 44 years. It too was returned. This story, along with the others, became the fabric of MIA, Stories of the Vietnam War Bracelet. DAV's Brian Lett sat down with Peggy Kennedy and Susan Crosby to discuss the project further.
All right, hello everybody. This is Brian Lett with DAV, and I got two very special guests with me today. That is Peggy Kennedy and Susan Crosby. They're involved in the MIA Stories of the Vietnam War Bracelet project, which are actually working on putting together a short film for to highlight the campaign and the project. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce Peggy Kennedy. And then Peggy, if you don't mind, just tell our listeners today a little bit about what got you involved in this, what the Vietnam War Bracelet is, and kind of what got you involved in it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. My creative partner, Roger, he wore one of the POWMIA memorial bracelets as a class project when he was in 7th grade. And years later, he discovered that people were still wearing them. So he became curious as to why, after all this time, they're still wearing the bracelets. So we decided that this would be a good way to honor our missing in action Vietnam veterans by telling their stories through the families who have suffered during this time period and the people who still wear the bracelets. Susan is our second interview that we've had.
Before we go over here to Susan, because I'm curious of your perspective on that, Susan, and what got you involved and what it meant to be included in that interview and hopefully the film. But the first one, Paula Banks, how did you hear about that story? I mean, I know for those that aren't familiar, I'll let Peggy go into detail, but it's a pretty amazing story that I think captures what this whole thing is about. If you don't mind, tell our listeners just a little bit about her story and how that got to your attention.
Sure, happy to. As I said, Roger had this idea probably 20 years ago, and he just felt that he couldn't find support for it. So I was on a trip, and I met this woman who was on the trip also. And so she had the perfect story for us because her brother enlisted in the Marines, and after basic training, he went to Vietnam and he was listed as missing in action within 6 months. And after 44 years, they found his remains. He came home to a full military funeral. And the bracelet wearer actually saw the publicity about the funeral service, and she came to the service and brought the bracelet back to the family.
Wow, that's amazing. I can only imagine what that meant to the family, after 4.5 decades. Please just tell our listeners a little bit about that film, where you're at in its production, and then maybe a little bit about what they may be able to see and take away from that experience.
Well, right now we're working on the first 10 to 15 minutes of it so that we can share with people the vision of what the completed film will be. We have 2 interviews, Paula, as you mentioned, and Susan, of course, who was with us. But we also, from a creative point of view, we want to spotlight as many of the service personnel that we can. So there were interviews that I did with Vietnam vets that the story wasn't full enough to warrant a 7 to 8 minute interview, but they said things that were so touching and so important that we are going to video record about 5 of those and have them talking about their bracelet and then actually show a photo of the soldier service person that they are wearing that bracelet for. So and then also we want to highlight in the course of this film some educational opportunities, because we know that younger people don't really A, know about the bracelets, B, know anything about the Vietnam War. So there will be educational portions to the film. In fact, one of the first ones that we will have in the first 10, 15 minutes is we're going to do man on the street interviews here in New York and show passerbys the bracelet and ask them if they know what it is, if they know anything about it. And then from there, we'll go into a narrative which explains how the bracelets got started by the 2 and then 3 college people in California who didn't want the POW MIAs to be forgotten back when this all first started happening. And so we will share information about that and the fact that 5 million of these were sold and what they were for and how people still have the same concern today.
I like the idea of the man on the street type of approach. I think that probably really opened some eyes. And given the age of many of these Vietnam vets, for all we know, you could be coming across one of their sons or their daughters or a relative, in that process because of the sheer numbers and the time frame. This question could go for either one of you, but obviously, you talk about Vietnam, there's roughly 2.8 million service members that served there. Roughly 850,000 of them alive today. And I know Peggy knows all this, and we're losing roughly 350 of them a day. So time is obviously important to try to live on these memories, these individuals' lives, their sacrifices, and not to mention their families. For either one of you, what is it like to be kind of so intimately involved in something that, really carries a lot of weight? And unfortunately, it's with a certain population that, maybe too much of America isn't thinking about or maybe has even forgotten. So I'm just curious from your personal level of experience for you both, what it means to be involved. It seems to be such a unique and inspiring thing to try to honor our service members and remember their sacrifice.
Well, maybe we can both answer this, but for me, we have such a great sense of urgency having spoken to so many Vietnam veterans, because a lot of these people, they are vets, but they're wearing the bracelet for other vets who they don't know. And when I talk to them, it's a very emotional thing. I would say 10%, 20% of the people I talk to have to stop because they are crying. So it just makes me realize that these missing in action have been, by the general population, they have virtually been forgotten. And our promise to them was that we would never forget them. So as the Vietnam vets are dying, as you just mentioned, and they are a population that still focuses on this, we just have a great sense of urgency to get this completed, because I just think these stories are going to go silent if we don't do something right now.
No, and that would be a great tragedy. I think we both know, or all of us know, Vietnam vets didn't have the easiest time even coming home. So This is, another aspect of that story. And if you don't mind, Susan, if you want, feel free to, have your own your say here and how what it means to you to be involved.
Sure. First of all, it's an honor for me to be a part of this project. It's something that I can be proud to participate in and to be part of. I think there's many stories about individual bracelets that should be told. And 50 years or so after the war, there's still 1,588 servicemen unaccounted for. And I feel that we as Americans need to remember that, and talking about the bracelets serves as a reminder of those that are still missing in action.
No, that makes perfect sense to me. To transition a little bit, if either one of you are able to, go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about the bracelet you're wearing, Susan, and who that individual is.
Sure. So my mother was a nurse at the VA hospital in Miami, Florida, and spent most of her nursing career in the VA hospital system. And back in the 70s, when the bracelets became popular and were being sold, she purchased a bracelet for me, and I was in my teens at that time, and I've just been able to hold on to it for 40 some years. And the person named on the bracelet is Lieutenant Colonel Carter Luna, and he was an Air Force pilot whose aircraft was hit in Laos on March 10th, 1969, and he survived when he and his weapons system officer in the back seat both ejected and landed safely on the ground. And he had radio communications for a while, but at some point those communications ended, and he's been unaccounted for since that day, March 10th, 1969. So I've made 2 trips to Laos, but the most recent one in March was to travel to the area where he was last known to be alive on the day 50 years later that he was downed there. And to go there to honor him and also to just see if there's the potential for learning any information about him.
In a nutshell, that is what this is all about. I mean, not only are you wearing the bracelet, but you're traveling abroad to see what you could figure out and find out and maybe even discover. But what was that experience like? I mean, I got to think that was pretty emotional and pretty impactful.
Yes, it was very emotional. And the strongest emotion was when I left Laos to go back to Thailand. I felt a very strong sense of abandonment. I felt guilty that I was able to leave the country, but knowing that somewhere Colonel Luna is left behind, it was a very sad moment to leave the area and something that I'll just always carry with me, something I just won't forget that experience and specifically that feeling of him being left behind. For
anybody listening, I mean, these are real people. These are real individuals that doing their best, sacrificing their own safety and in many ways, obviously, their own freedoms to protect ours. These aren't just, I don't want to say empty bracelets, but there are stories behind these. And that's, thank you for sharing that one.
Our website is www.miabraceletmovie.com. In there, people can actually donate through the website, but we have a fiscal sponsor, the New York Women in Film and Television, of which I am a member. And if people want to contribute through them, they get a tax deduction.
No, that's great. If there's anybody that's listening that thinks they want to get involved, please check out that website. Please contact Peggy, and please do so. This is an important topic, and it's one of those things that, we did make a promise, and we want to uphold it. This isn't a trend we want to see continue. This is something we want to do our due diligence and take care of those that have taken care of us and our freedom. Is there anything, Peggy, that maybe I failed to ask, or anything that you would like listener to know that we have not touched on?
There is one thing. Susan and I both attended the POW-MIA League of Families 50th anniversary annual meeting in D.C., and that is where families come and they will meet with representatives of the military to see what progress has been made about finding their loved ones. And it was interesting for me to see that the countries are now collaborating with our country to help find our soldiers. And the countries, I mean Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Because of the DNA and underwater research that is now available, they are finding these people. The woman who started this League of Families, her brother went missing 52 years ago, and he was a pilot and crashed in deep water. And a year before Susan and I went to this meeting, so in 2018, they found him and he was just buried at Arlington. And the families do have some hope.
Outstanding. I mean, that's, I think, a lot of what this is about is restoring some of that hope and hopefully bringing home some loved ones who sacrificed so much. And again, if you're listening and you want to check it out, it's miabraceletmovie.com. I want to thank Peggy Kennedy. I want to thank Susan Crosby, both for your time today, and not just that, but for the effort you're both putting in to shed light on this issue that has probably long been forgotten. And unfortunately, that's just not good enough. So I know I appreciate everything you guys are doing. I appreciate your time stopping by our podcast, and I look forward to talking to you both in the near future.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
So one of the things people might not know is that DAV actually has a group, which is our interim POW-MIA committee, that meets regularly to discuss POW-MIA information and informs the national organization, primarily our national commander, of actionable issues relating to that subject. So each year at our national convention, our members introduce and vote on resolutions to help guide our national advocacy efforts, the things that we guide our national legislative program on. And some of these resolutions have to do with the POW-MIA cause. That's things like expanding presumptions for service connection for former POWs, providing support for the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, and providing support to renew discussions with counterpart nations that are required to account for unreturned remains of American military personnel. Vince Starcangelo is the committee chairman, and he has been deeply committed to this cause for many, many years. And we were fortunate enough to catch up with him to talk a little bit about what the committee is focusing on today.
I'm with Vince Starcangelo, again, the DAV's interim POW-MIA committee chairman. And it's no secret that DAV has a long and rich history of advocating on behalf of our nation's wartime ill and injured. But what about the ones that are still missing or unaccounted for? Vince, tell me a little bit about the efforts of the committee.
Well, the committee, our intent is to increase public awareness of and support any effort to bring our missing home. In fact, we demand that if there are any countries still holding our missing, we demand the immediate release of those.
And that's interesting because I know it says something about our nation that we are a nation that years or in decades can go by, but we will still return to the battlefields of the past to recover the smallest remains that can be found in the hopes that they can be identified. And we're here at the DAV's 90th National Convention in Orlando, Florida, and I actually got to catch the seminar for POW MIA with the officials from the DoD, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, and the work they're doing is just incredible. You feel free to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Korea and in Vietnam?
Well, there is no nation that spends more resources than the United States to bring their missing home. There are countries that put forth a good effort, but nothing like the magnitude that the United States does. We have teams in countries all over the world looking for our missing, and the DoD's object is to find them, identify them, and bring them home.
And so I know that they said that the priority right now is actually Vietnam, and if I understand that correctly, it has to do with the aging Vietnam veteran population and their families, and as well as some environmental concerns. The acidic in the soil is kind of decomposing human remains at a faster rate than in Europe or in Korea.
Much faster, and that's our concern. The Vietnam conflict is the most recent when you compare Korea and World War II, which is where the three emphases are on the issue. The witnesses that may still be alive to tell you, well, we saw a plane go down here, and where we saw a POW and he was buried, and over there. The witnesses are dying. We're an aging population. I'm in my 70s. So are the witnesses, and in addition to that, the acidic ground, it destroys remains to the point that there may not be able to get the DNA samples from the remains which would necessarily hinder identification. We know that we've left men behind in every conflict, and Vietnam specifically. I've seen compelling evidence of that. The pilots and crews were trained in escape and evasion techniques in case they were shot down. They were given secret codes, an authenticator number. If they get on the ground, they were taught to disrupt the landscape, disrupt the land, doing any number of things. They could put their authenticator code down, and then we know exactly who it is that's down there. There was a reliable code that it was a K. If you were on the ground and you were out in duress, you could stomp out the letter K. If you put a little foot on one of the legs of the K, that would mean you're on the ground. And we had reconnaissance aircraft all the time looking for such signs and signals. We had satellite imagery that would be always looking for those authenticator codes. And eventually, and again, the pilots and crews and special forces, they were all taught to leave these codes if they were waiting to be rescued.
And this is in Vietnam specifically?
This was all over.
Okay, wow.
All over.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I know the United States has a very good working relationship with the country of Vietnam to repatriate American war dead. But the country that we may not have as well as the relations with, but we have a lot of war dead still, and that's of course North Korea. And everyone probably knows about all the good efforts of the Americans as well as the North Koreans. In fact, last year, 55 sets of remains were flown from North Korea to South Korea and then to the DoD's lab in Hawaii. And they were able to actually find out who some of these people were, and we're talking about 60 years ago.
Yes. One of the problems with North Korea, they would store and warehouse our remains and only agree to give them back to us when the price was right, when they could get the most out of our country. And so what they would do to preserve the remains, they would put formaldehyde on them. And the formaldehyde would take away the DNA, so that when we did get them back, it made it more difficult to actually identify the DNA. Due to our scientific expertise, we have our scientists have done the next generation DNA testing, and so we have overcome that formaldehyde problem. And we're the only country that was using that technique.
Interesting. And we talked a lot about DNA and a lot of stuff that happens in the lab, but a lot of things when we talk about recovering American war dead off the battlefields, sometimes it doesn't require that. It just takes old-fashioned, historical research, archival research, and some analysis. The case that was talked about yesterday was a Korean War soldier who was killed on the battlefield. And so when America got the remains from North Korea, they were able to find out there were some documents, so we found out where in North Korea they were, what units were there. Of course, we have the actual physical remains of a skeleton, so we can height, what race they are, ethnicity, what sex they are, if they're a man or a woman, age. And the case yesterday, again, was close to 6 or 7, maybe 8,000 people, potential people this could be. We'll let down to find out this is actually this one individual, and that wasn't using any DNA at all. And I thought that was fascinating.
A lot of times they have to use circumstantial evidence, and let me tell you, they go to great lengths not to misidentify a set of remains.
I just want to note it's because of the dogged determination of individuals like Vince and like so many others that even today, we're still seeing remains returned home. To Vince's point, it's not always easy to properly identify remains. And after so long, I'm sure that there are people, family members, friends who feel like it may be a lost cause. But there was just a story about a man named Robert Hatch, who's a Marine who fought in World War II. He died in 1943 in the Battle of Tarawa. And in 1949, his remains were actually categorized as non-recoverable. But in December, his remains were positively identified and will now be returning home in Utah for burial in December. So that is why we want to call to mind why this is so important and why it remains something that DAV focuses on and why we as a nation can't forget.
So, Ashley, obviously this has been a great episode to talk about, really an important topic. And it's amazing that so many still missing in action and all the people it's impacted here. But this is just one of the topics we're tackling. We've got a lot of good stuff coming up here on the DAV podcast ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're going to talk about in our next episode an interesting topic that it's sort of on the horizon. We're sort of in it now, but LGBT veterans population. We know it's growing. We know that there are issues that are going to be needing more attention. And so we're happy to dive into that topic a little bit in the next episode. Women veterans, it's always top of mind. We're always thinking about that. We have a lot going on. There's some legislation coming up that we're pretty excited about. And we have a phenomenal interview with Hollywood legend Dale Dye, a fellow Marine who is very involved with making sure that what you see on screen is an accurate and fair representation of the military experience.
Oh, man, I can't wait to see that. I love all those movies. And the year's wrapping up here at DAV, and it's been a great year. We've made a lot of strides in helping veterans. What were some of those key highlights that, as we look back, we can really be proud of and know that we're making a difference out there? Yeah,
so one of the big ones that we've been really highly focused on is Blue Water Navy veterans. There was some significant legislation passed this year, and on January 1st, it's going to take effect into law. So Blue Water Navy veterans will become eligible for specific benefits. And so we're just going to be there to make sure that in 2020, on January 1st, when that starts, that the implementation is taking effect as intended. We have some, like I said, women veterans legislation that just passed in the House Veterans Affairs Committee, the Deborah Sampson Act, which includes a lot of provisions that DAV has been a part of bringing to the table. So we're very excited to see some movement on that. And of course, caregiver expansion. We had this great piece of legislation that came through within the Mission Act that will be expanding caregiver benefits through the VA to pre-9/11 veterans. But we want to make sure that, again, that's implemented correctly. Like getting the legislation passed is just half the battle. Now we have to make sure that they see it through. So you can see a lot more from us here in 2020 on caregiver expansion for sure.
The work is never done, and that's why we always need your help, too. If you'd like to help us help over 1 million veterans every single year, you can donate to DAV, DAV.org. And as we said, if you're a veteran that needs help, find all the information on all of our free programs and resources out there to help you get your benefits, about our job fairs, volunteer services, obviously so much for you at DAV.org. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast as well. You can do that on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Stitcher. For all of us here at DAV and Ashley Burns, I'm Dan Klaskins. We'll see you next time right here on the DAV Podcast.